Okay, let's begin. Thank you all so much for coming to Rematriation and the Land Back movement. Before I begin, I would like to state that the land on which I speak today is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe, the Amamutsin tribal band comprised of the descendants of Indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. I was just having this conversation with Corrina that I was sort of on the fence about whether or not to do a land acknowledgement. And I say that because land acknowledgements that are not followed by action are largely empty. And I really want to think about this conversation, particularly today, about action. And I offer this acknowledgement today with the knowledge that UC Santa Cruz as an institution has in fact returned the ancestors that were held captive on campus, and is making a concerted effort to collaborate with the Amamutsin tribe as well as the Amamutsin Land Trust. And I will say that for those of you today, if you do a land acknowledgement in your events or on your syllabus, I urge you to consider action that you will make for the community, and thinking about sort of land acknowledgements actually as a verb, as something that is then followed by an action, something that you do. So I'd also like to thank the folks who made this presentation today possible, as well as our feminist studies staff, including Lisa and Taylor, and our Zoom pair extraordinaire, Louise. So thank you all for joining us. I'm Katie Kali'ia'a. I'm a feminist studies professor here in the Department of Feminist Studies at UC Santa Cruz. Some of you may know that this presentation today is a part of my Indigenous Feminisms class offered this quarter at UC Santa Cruz. And before I introduce our guest, I would like to kind of give you a little bit of the background of how today's presentation is going to go. We're going to start off with a 1-hour presentation from our speaker today. And after that, we'll do a 30-minute Q&A. And for those of you who aren't familiar with webinars, the best way to ask a question at that point, and I'll remind folks later on, is to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So when you have questions during that Q&A portion, use the Q&A button for that. All right, well, let's begin. I would like to first read a bio off for our speaker today. Corrina Gould is the co-founder and co-director of the Sogorea Te Land Trust, born and raised in her ancestral homeland, the Ohlone territory of Huchiun. She is the tribal chair and traditional spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of Lisjan Ohlone. With that said, please welcome Corrina Gould.
Corrina, good day. My name is Corrina Gould. I am the traditional spokesperson and tribal chair of the Confederated Villages of Lisjan. I'm also the co-director of the Sogorea Te Land Trust. I want to thank Professor Katie Kali'ia'a for inviting me here, and UC Santa Cruz community for inviting me to be a part of a conversation that I hope will open up our eyes and create some questions about what rematriation is and what land back really means. When I start off this presentation, I want to talk about what it means to actually get to the point where we are talking about rematriation and land back. And what does that mean to us? And so the Sogorea Te Land Trust is an urban Indigenous women-led land trust that is on my home territory of the East Bay in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it was created out of a lot of work that happened before we got to a land trust at all. And it's important. So we're going to go through a little bit of history. I thought that we'd start off that way. I'm not a traditional storyteller, but I am Indigenous. So there's a lot of stories that are going to happen during this presentation. And I hope that it opens up a lot of questions about what we can talk about when we're talking about rematriation and land back. Okay, so let's see if this is going to work. My body is a cartography of stories, of ancestors asking not to be forgotten. We are not a conquered people. A quote from Rowan White, who this really speaks to me because our landscape changed at the point of colonization and contact with other people. And our bodies as Indigenous people hold on to the histories and the stories of what this landscape has been for thousands of years prior to other people coming here. And this is my traditional territory. It's a traditional territory now known as the East Bay. And if you see where Huchiun is right here, that's where I'm at right now. So I live in the territory of Huchiun. My ancestors come from many of these different places along the bay. And the Confederated Villages of Lisjan is actually 5 different tribes that were brought into slavery at Missions Dolores in San Francisco and Mission San Jose and Fremont. And so our tribe is a confederation of Ohlone, what people now know as Ohlone, Bay Miwok, Plains Miwok, Napian, and Delta Yokut. And so our tribes encompass most of the area that you see on the left-hand side of your screen. Ohlone is actually a generic term. It's actually not a term that we used throughout history. It was a term that came up later on. Most people think of Ohlone people as one people, but we are actually 8 different nations of people with 8 different languages, 8 different creation stories. Our songs and our dances are different from south to north. And when Spanish first came here, they noticed that most of the people dressed alike and they ate the same kind of foods and they wore the same kind of clothes and all of those kinds of things. And so they kind of just switched us into this name of Costanoan. Around the 50s and 60s, people began to say, that's not who we are. We don't want to be called that anymore. Let us come up with a different name. And they came up with the name Ohlone. And actually, most of the northern people identify with that term more so than the southern part of territories. And so we've been using that name. And some people may know of this book that was written over 40 years ago called The Ohlone Way. Malcolm Margolin wrote that book and really told a story about what the landscape may have looked like many years ago, and really kind of put us back on the map to begin talking to us as people maybe in the present. Our ancestors lived in villages along the bay for thousands and thousands of years before first contact. And my ancestors lived in a way that many of us talk about now, as climate justice leaders, as we're looking at climate disaster, people are talking about leaving a smaller footprint on the earth. My ancestors actually lived in the Bay Area like that. Our houses and our boats, our skirts, our bedding, many things were made out of tule and other materials that would biodegrade and go back into the land. And so there was very little left of my ancestors except for shell mounds, our burial sites, and some implements like mortars and pestles and a few other things that we were buried with. But many of our things were gone. And it was a way of living in reciprocity with the land, a way of knowing that we were a part of the land, not apart from the land. It wasn't until the missionaries came with Spanish soldiers and they changed not only the way that we live, but they changed the landscape, began to change the landscape of our territories. With the Spanish missionaries came Spanish soldiers, and came disease, and it came the idea of slavery and of murder and of whipping, things and rape, things my ancestors had not really dealt with prior to contact. With them also came these different animals that changed the landscape, things that we think of that all the time that are here: pigs, sheep, goats, donkeys, horses, changed the landscape and the waterways of our landscapes. We had, if you can imagine, the Bay Area with huge fields of grasses and flowers, wildflowers. Our people actually ate many of those kinds of seeds, although we hear about us eating acorns, and yes, we love acorns and they're yummy. We actually had used the seeds from many of those different wildflowers as sustenance food for many, many thousands of years. But when other animals came here and began to graze them away, they also grazed away not just food materials, but our medicines. Living in the missions created diseases and ways for us not to get rid of sicknesses, and because we couldn't go out and get medicines that may have made us feel better. And so our the rate of death in these missions were very high. My ancestors actually died of malnutrition. It was told that the foods that were given in the missions to many of our ancestors had less nutritional value than the food that was given to those that were imprisoned in Auschwitz. And so our ancestors died of many different things. And one of the things that they died of was heartbreak. Imagine having your landscape and the way of life changed in such a dramatic way in such a short period of time that you actually died because of heartbreak. So these 21 missions or prisons were built on stolen land. And the colonization that happened in California was different than happened on the East Coast. You see, at the same time that people on the East Coast were signing their Declaration of Independence was just about the time that the Spanish missionaries got up here to our territory. And so the Spanish missionaries came up here and began to build these prisons, not just missions. They imprisoned the people, the native people from the area. It was what I relate to it as the first prison industrial complex of California. Our ancestors were forced to build their own prison systems and were forced, once they were baptized, could not leave there without being afraid of being brought back by Spanish soldiers and whipped or killed. And so it was a very scary time. And the mission system actually only lasted 99 years. This man named Junipero Serra, who was recently created a saint in 2015, was the person that brought the Spanish missions here. And he created the first 9 of those 21 missions. 2 of those missions my ancestors were enslaved in, Mission Dolores and Mission San Jose. My ancestors built these missions, were enslaved in those missions, had our language and our culture stripped away from us at these missions, and our lifeways. And so for us, it's a very scary time. But it didn't end with the missions there, right? Then Mexico stole the land and continued the enslavement of indigenous people. And this part of history is hardly ever spoken about in history books. It's hardly ever spoken about. They didn't do a lot of writing down about my ancestors during this period. It was just something that happened. When Mexico received its independence from Spain, they closed down the Spanish missions. They actually made the land around the Spanish missions much smaller, and then gave huge swaths of land to Mexican gentry and Spanish soldiers. And my ancestors, or where I live right now, is Rancho San Antonio, or Peralta land grant. And if you're from the Bay Area, you hear Peralta's name all over the place. There's Peralta School District, and there's Peralta houses, and there's streets named after Peralta. And they had these haciendas, these houses, these homes that were these adobe places that were built all over the place. And the land base of just the Peraltas went from about San Leandro to Albany. And my ancestors lived there and we continue to live here. We're still on our own lands. And if you can imagine that, that my ancestors went from being slaves at the missions to being slaves on these ranchos, because we had no land then to go back to. And because all of our land was then parceled out to someone else. And so even if we were to go back to our homeland, we were squatting on someone else's ranch. And so we very clearly became the slaves of these ranchers. The land grants that they were given came with the Indians living on it. And so my ancestors built one of the famous haciendas here in Oakland, and actually lived in the house, the adobe house, for 8 years prior to the Peraltas coming and living on that land. And then they were kicked out and were made to live beside the house in traditional tule houses and things. So my ancestors became these people that lived and worked on these ranches and were not really written about during this period. In 1848, Mexico and America had a war, and the land was stolen for a 3rd time. So we're in a 3rd wave of stealing. We went from slavery in the Spanish period to slavery again in the Mexico Rancho period. And then this war happened. And for The third time it was stolen, and this time the US, instead of slavery, it was about creating mass extermination on our lands. California spent $1.4 million killing California Native people, $5 a head and 25 cents an ear. They allowed for the outright murder of California Native people. It was backed by federal dollars. And people, we hear about my ancestors in fourth grade, right? All fourth graders in the Bay Area learn about Ohlone people in fourth grade. And they talk about us in the past, always. And then you get to fifth grade and you learn about the gold rush and everybody coming here for gold. And well, the interesting thing is that there was massive amounts of men that came here looking for gold, but not everybody could find gold. But they put this law into effect that made it illegal to be Indian and legalized the murder of Indians. And people would create these Sunday gatherings where they would go out and look for California Native people in villages and kill off the adults and bring in their heads and ears for a bounty. And then they would gather the children and they would sell them in the city and the towns, somewhere like $300 for a little girl, up to $200 for a little boy. They also created these vagrancy laws in California, which always kinds of makes me a little fearful today because of all the people living on the streets right now. These vagrancy laws that were created made it illegal for a Native person to say anything against a white man in a court of law. And so if a miner or a rancher or someone needed help or free slave labor, they could take a Native person off the street and drag them into a court before a justice and say that they were vagrant. And that judge would give that white person, this Native person, for free for up to 40 years. And so although California was created as a free state, people coming over looking for free gold, bringing their slaves, couldn't necessarily enslave them continuously. But in California, Native people were slaves here for those ranchers and for people that were looking at mining. In 1909, Nels Nelson, who worked at UC Berkeley, created a map. And I talked about shell mounds before, these cemeteries that my ancestors left behind. You see, we were erased from history after the gold rush. We weren't talked about in the Bay Area anymore. San Francisco was created and this great metropolis was here. And the Indians just disappeared from history books. No one talked about us anymore. We were invisibilized. We were white papered out of history. And it continues today. It's not like there's anyone that talked about us. And no one talked about shell mounds. No one knew what shell mounds were, right? Until about 20 years ago, we began to do work on shell mounds in the Bay Area to educate people about what was here and what lies beneath the streets, in parking lots, railroad tracks, bars, and schools in the Bay Area. You see, Nels Nelson created this map in 1909 because he knew that these shell mounds or burial sites and village sites of my ancestors were important. But he also knew that there was so much development happening over 100 years ago, if he didn't put them down, that they would be lost forever. And so I wasn't thought about at this time. My mother wasn't even born, but it is because I believe there were a few people back in history that my ancestors was in their ear and they had them do this work. That Nels Nelson put down this map of 425 shell mounds that ring the Bay Area. And we've since found more, but 425 shell mounds, burial sites, village places, the abundance of people and living here in the Bay Area. 200 years ago, things were different in the Bay Area. If you think about the Bay Area, you have to think about the Bay Area in an abundance. Our songs that were created were always about abundance and thankful for all of the things that we had here. If you think about the Bay Area and you look at it today, you can't even imagine what it would look like without city streets and buildings on it. But it was only 200 years ago that anything was built here. It's like 200 years ago, there was not a concept of hunger or homelessness in this territory. Imagine that any freshwater creek that you found in the Bay Area, you could drink out of. The water was clean enough to drink. Now, this isn't that long ago, right? My auntie is 84 years old. She's the matriarch of our tribe. Just about two of her lifetimes ago that this happened, that this change, that this drastic change where we have polluted the bay in such a way that we can't even eat fish more than once a week out of it is amazing. Over 2 decades ago, my friend Janella LaRose, who helped me create Indian People Organizing for Change, which was the precursor to the Sogorea Te Land Trust, knew that this was happening, that the shell mounds were being disturbed. And the reason we knew about the shell mounds being disturbed so much is because we started getting a lot of phone calls. Janella was a organizer for the Carpenters Union in the Bay Area. And I was doing a lot of organizing around the base closures. Her and I were doing a lot of work around the base closures that were happening in the Bay Area at the time, the Naval Station in Alameda, the Army base in Oakland. And there was development happening during that time because there was something called the internet that was created. Now, thankfully, today, we're happy we could all be in this space together because of the internet. But if you imagine, not that long ago, there was no capacity for us to sit in a room like we are today, right? And during that time, there was development that was happening, much like development is happening all over the place right now. We see cranes in the sky everywhere and not the birds, right? These massive amounts of building that's happening. Well, during the what I call the .com era, when internet blew up here in the Bay Area, people began to outbid each other for houses and apartments. And it created this mass wave of gentrification in the Bay Area. And at the same time that there was huge development that was happening and our shell mounds were being destroyed. They were finding our ancestral bodies under places in San Jose where they wanted to put a swimming pool, under the Bay Street Mall, where they have created a mall in Emeryville. And because people did not know about it, you didn't learn about shell mounds in school. And unless you were in anthropology or archaeology in the Bay Area, you didn't know what a shell mound was. So we created a walk to the shell mound, starting in Vallejo and walking to San Jose and up to San Francisco in 2005. We did this walk with people from all over the world. People came from Japan and the South and the Cape Verde Islands, from Nova Scotia and from Australia, and they walked with us to all of these shell mounds, walking 18 miles a day, walking in prayer and laying down our prayers at these shell mounds that were under buildings and apartments and railroad tracks and parking lots. And as we did this, we reminded the ancestors that we were here and remembered them, and they remembered us. And you'll see that these Japanese Buddhist monks were walking with us, these Buddhists, and this Buddhist nun, Jun-san, who's very famous around the world. This is a particular sect of Buddhist monks, the Nihon Mahoji Buddhist sect. They walk for nuclear proliferation. And in 1978, they walked across the country with American Indian movement and people from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. And they did this walk with American Indian people because their Fuji Guruji, their leader, told them that the Japanese people must work with the American Indian people because it was uranium taken off of Indian land that created the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In order for that to never happen again, we must work together. And so the Japanese people have been walking with us for over 40 years on walks all over the place. And Jun-san, this little Buddhist nun, was actually given land in Haudenosaunee territory to create a Buddhist temple. And she lives there right now, and she does work all over the world. But she came here, she first moved into the American Indian movement house in Oakland. And she was there when Janella LaRose, the co-founder of the organization, was there raising her small children. And so our relationship with these people have been very long. For every year on the day after Thanksgiving, for 20 years now, we have been gathering at the corner of Shellmound Street and Ohlone Way in Emeryville, a place where the largest of all 425 shell mounds was destroyed. And during the dot-com era, they decided, the city of Emeryville decided that they were going to put a green mall on top of it. This mall sits along Temescal Creek, and it was the largest of the 425. It was over 60 feet high and 350 feet in diameter. If you can imagine your hand as the largest one, and then there were smaller ones that came off of it. It was a huge funerary complex. It was a place where people lived for thousands and thousands of years. And when they decided to put this mall on top of our shell mound, they knew it was there because they had destroyed it years before. And they decided to clean up this place. It was during the dot-com era as well. This place was a brownfield, and they got federal money to clean it up. And with the federal money to clean it up, they decided also to put this mall on top of it. We went and we fought against it and lost. We came into the process late. They decided to create this little tiny hill that's supposed to represent thousands of years of my ancestors being there. They have some writing on it that, not on it, but nearby, that talks about some of the history, and then it just kind of fades away like all history about Ohlone people. They took replicas of our artifacts and put them in glass boxes as you're walking into the bathroom, which is very disrespectful to us. And so every year on the day after Thanksgiving, hundreds of people show up with signs and giving out information and praying, because this site is still sacred to us. Even as much as you put on top of it, we know that our ancestors are still buried below. We talk about rematriation, and rematriation is a word. I've been trying to come in conversation about rematriation and what does this mean. And we use this word in the work that we do for the Sogorea Te Land Trust. And when we first started using the word rematriation, it really stuck with us because of the story I'm going to tell you pretty soon. But this one that Steve Newcomb did in 1998 actually talks about a portion of what he talks about inside of his small article. It says, I mean to restore a living culture to its rightful place on Mother Earth, or to restore a people to a spiritual way of life and sacred relationship with their ancestral lands without external interference. As a concept, rematriation acknowledges that our ancestors lived in spiritual relationship with our lands for thousands of years, and that we have a sacred duty to maintain that relationship for the benefit of future generations. And I agree with this, this rematriation definition, and I think that it leaves out an important concept of women. Even though it may be implied, it doesn't actually say it. And so I think that we need to begin to think about what is our role as women in the movement of rematriation, in the balancing of the world. So rematriation is really about creating that balance again. Where have we come away from that balance? And this giving us a reason for of having our relationship with our ancestral lands. This is the first piece of land that was given back or rematriated. Rematriation for me right now is beginning to feel kind of like decolonized did when decolonized became a catchphrase. People are talking about rematriation a lot, right? We're going to rematriate this and we're going to rematriate that. But what does that really mean, to rematriate something? Does it mean to come into balance with the world? Does it mean to come back to your sacred songs and dances? Does it mean those kinds of things? What does that balance exactly mean? You see, we didn't actually start out as Sogorea Te Land Trust to become a land trust. We started out doing the work around the sacred, around protecting our sacred sites, around trying to figure out how do we then get our land, how do we get our ancestors out of the institutions that they sit in, right? That was the prayer. The prayer for all of those years that we were walking was to bring those ancestral remains out of UC Berkeley, out of San Francisco State, out of all of these institutions in the Bay Area that held our ancestral remains. Why could an institution hold over 9,000 of your ancestral remains? But then when we began to think about it, we realized that Ohlone people are not federally recognized. We don't have a land base. What if UC Berkeley was to say, hey, Corrina, come get your ancestors. We're done. We can have them, right? Where was I going to take them? Where would we put those ancestral remains? Can you imagine having to rebury 9,000 ancestors? What does that look like? And how much land do you need? And when you're a non-federally recognized tribe who has been written out of history, who has been continuously told that you don't exist, when everybody that you talk to says that you're dead, what does that mean? How do you get the land back to bring those ancestors home? And that prayer of walking the shell mounds, the prayer of sitting in front of the Hearst Museum, those prayers of going to those sacred sites, what does that mean? How do we do that? So the land trust came into fruition because we took over a sacred site in 2011. In April, it'll be 10 years ago. A place called Sogorea Te, a place on the Carquinez Strait, the last 13 acres of open land there, a place that had 2 shell mounds on top of it, a place that for 12 and a half years, Wounded Knee de Ocampo had fought to save and stop the desecration from happening. And in April of that year, the city of Vallejo filed bankruptcy and gave the park district $30,000 worth of permits for free to destroy that site. And so we went there and we lit a sacred fire that lasted for 109 days. And people came together and lived on that land in ceremony for that long. And it changed our lives. It changed who we were. It changed our DNA. And soon after that, Beth Rose Middleton, who is a professor at UC Davis, she did her dissertation at UC Berkeley. She wrote a book called Trust in the Land. And that book talks about Native Land Trust. She invited me to a meeting of Native Land Trusts in Southern California about 6 months after the occupation had ended. And I went there not knowing what I was going there for. I had no idea what a land trust was, but I trusted Beth Rose and I went to this meeting. And when I got to this meeting, there were a handful of tribes, federally recognized and non-federally recognized. And they were talking about buying back their own land and buying back their sacred sites. Some of them had casinos. And so they were talking specifically about buying back their sacred land, their sacred places, their places that had their medicine places, and doing that. There were non-federally recognized tribes in Northern California that had long-term leases on an acre of land so that they could tell their story, that they could do their traditional things. And there was one guy there, his name is Dune Lankard. He's an Alaskan native who saved 140,000 acres of his land, his homeland, after an Exxon Valdez spill. And when I'm sitting in this room, I'm looking around and there's like almost all men in this room, right? And so I said, I'm at lunch one day with Dune and I said, hey, Dune, is this a boys club? And Dune laughed and he said, yeah, kinda. You know, not just Native Land Trust, but all land trusts are run by men. And I was like, whoa, that's kind of interesting. So I came back to the Bay Area and I had a conversation with Janelle and I said, hey, I think this is a tool that we didn't have. And I think we should try to do a land trust. And I told her the story about Dune. And she said, and we both decided that this land trust that we were going to create needed to be an urban Indigenous women-led land trust. That there needed to be balance brought back to the land. That when we look at what has happened to the land across the world, really, when we looked at Indigenous land, what has happened to our lands happened to women's bodies. The taking of the sacred, the raping of the land, the total destruction of who the land was and who we are as women. And that there needs to be a balance right now. Our medicine people are telling us that it's time for women to stand in their rightful place. When we look at our traditional people, many of our traditional tribes were matrilineal. We are matriarchs. Our women hold songs for the waters and for our basket making materials. We bury our children's and our grandchildren's umbilical cords into the land so that they're always connected since the beginning of time. We are both the people that bring in life and also escort life out. And that when colonization happened, that those sacred duties were taken from us. But not only were they taken from women, the sacred duties of men were taken. The sacred duties of our sacred non-binary relatives were taken. That those sacredness needs to come back into balance so that this earth can reheal herself. And so that's our responsibility. That's about rematriation. That's the key to it, is to bring this balance back. So this first piece of land is in Oakland on 105th Avenue on a piece of property that's called Planting Justice. It's an organic nursery. And this group, Planting Justice, works with formerly incarcerated men and women. And they actually go into San Quentin and different places, and they train them. And once they come out, they have the opportunity to work at this garden, this nursery, making a living wage, really. But they went to Standing Rock. Gavin Raiders and Hale Zella went to Standing Rock. And when they went to Standing Rock, they were so moved by what had happened, what was going on there, that they asked the elders what they should do when they came home. And the elders told them that they should work with the First Nation peoples on whose land they're on. And they took that to heart. And the summer they came back, they asked Diane Williams, who's an Athabascan elder who is working with them as an educator, who they should talk to. And she said, well, you need to talk to Janella and Corrina. And we were hesitant because we didn't know who they were and why they wanted to talk to us, right? And finally, we went and sat with them under this California walnut tree. And they told us that story. And they said, we would like to give you this 1/4 acre of land where you see these people standing here in a circle back. And we didn't know what to say. We had not had any land in 250 years in our territory. We didn't know what to think about it. We said yes, of course, right? But there were some stipulations that we had about it. You see, my ancestors are tricky guys, and they have been showing me miracles all along my journey. You see, this water here and under the freeway is Lisjan water, who we're named after. And this freeway you see in the background is actually on fill. So the bay used to come right up to there. So this land is quite possibly a village site of my ancestors. And it's a half-mile walk from my home. So these ancestors are continuously showing me these miracles. So we told Gavin and Hale, yes, that we would love to have this land back. And the stipulation was that we were going to pay Janella's salary to be on that land for a year so that she could make relationships with the people that work there. How weird would it be for us to get land and have to walk all the way across this land that these people and not have relationships with them and not know who their stories are and them not know what our story was. And so we did that. We hired another person, another couple of people, and they worked the land and they cleaned it and they began to make hugels and to get ready for an arbor. An arbor is our traditional dance place, a place of ceremony, a place where we gather to have celebrations, and we have not had one in our territory in 250 years. And Janella said, let's build an arbor. And, Janella has always been this one person that has all these ideas. And then, then you're like, okay. And then it gets scary after that. And so we said, yes. So, but how are we going to do that? Because this is to scale, but you imagine that each of these poles represents a redwood tree. And what does that mean? And how do you get redwood trees in Oakland? Because they cut them off, almost all of them out of the hills. Well, it turns out that after many months, we contacted a friend of a friend who owns some land up in Sonoma County. And they said, we have some land and it needs to be thinned out and you're welcome to come and get them. Well, of course, the Indians said, yeah, let's go get them without any, let's get a couple of chainsaws and let's go for it. And had no experience taking down trees, right? Crazy. Except we went about it in a whole different way. There was a young man who worked at Planting Justice, whose job was on the fire lines while he was in prison. And this young African-American kid, we asked him, could he be our lead? And he could actually talk to trees. There's a way that people go into certain situations and they know how to do that. And this young man's heart, he knew how to talk to trees. And we went with our elders and we put down tobacco at each of these trees. And we asked them to give their lives so that we could create this arbor. And nobody was hurt in the taking of the trees. They gave their lives for us. And each of these pieces, because that's not a full tree, that's one log that we cut out of one of the trees, weighed about 700 pounds because they were full of water. And of course, Oakland, we went up there with some U-Haul trucks to load these logs on. And we dragged them down to Oakland and we thought, oh, we'll get the arbor up in a month. And of course, those trees taught us so many lessons and they kicked our asses, and it took us a year. We had people come out to the land from all walks of life, and they helped us to debark the redwoods, to move them around, to sand them down, to ready the land, to get it ready for us to put this arbor up. And 2 years ago in May, we put up the arbor. These poles were going up. This is the women's pole going up. We did a pole specifically for women, and then there was one for men, one for children, and one for elders, and one for our two-spirit crew that is always kicking ass with us. And to remember the relationship between all of us, that there's always been a sacred relationship. And so that arbor has gone up. We were hoping last spring to dance this arbor in, and this arbor traditionally, and the arbor was not danced in traditionally. We have been saving seeds from tobacco plants and saving seeds from white sage. And from those seeds, we planted hundreds of plants to give away at this. And then COVID hit, and we weren't able to dance in this arbor in a traditional way. We were able to give those plants away for people. And so the work continues. We started to learn how to gather again and to weave tule reeds to create a shade space for our elders in that arbor. And learning with elders and young people from many Indigenous backgrounds to do this work again. This is rematriation work. It's the remembering of what it is to be in sacred relationship with the lands that you're on. When that sacred relationship happened, when we put up those shade things, and one of our little relatives came and they made a home there. And so, we were blessed in that kind of way. Bringing elders back out onto the land to relearn how to harvest and to use our traditional soap roots in so many different ways, and to learn when we're supposed to take it and how we're supposed to take it, and remembering that together as an intergenerational kind of work. And so that's my grandson right there, my oldest, holding all that soap root. And then the Chochenyo language classes came back. In order for us to have that connection with our land again, the land needs to hear the language again. It needs to hear the language of the people that have been there forever. If you can imagine that California was one of the most diverse places in the world. It had so many languages here. And here in the Bay Area, I think there's over 70 languages that are spoken here. Not one of them is Chochenyo. Now, there's something wrong with that, intrinsically wrong, with the language being erased from its land. What does it mean to bring that land back, that language back? That language that is supposed to be here, those songs that are supposed to happen on this land, those ceremonies that are supposed to take place here. My daughter, Deja, is the caretaker of our language. She is teaching language. She is going back to school so that she could actually study language in the place that holds our language. Institutions hold our information. They have access to information that we don't. And so we're investing in her going to school to do that kind of work so that it can really come back. If you imagine, there are hundreds of languages that are asleep. My great-grandfather, Jose Guzman, was one of the last speakers of our language. So our language just went to sleep and we don't have access to them. And most language carriers are doing this on their own on the weekends and on vacation and trying to get people together without even having someone that has a grasp of the grammar of how do we put it together. And so she's doing that right now. But she's also teaching class via Skype or via Zoom. Every week we have classes, intergenerational classes that are happening. The kids learn head, shoulders, knees, and toes in the language. She did a whole video on how to wash your hands during COVID in the language. And so the language is coming back in a different kind of way. And it's a beautiful, beautiful way for us to do that. Babies are involved, and we're putting the language on the on our land and are naming the plants that we're growing, the traditional plants that are being brought back onto the land that have gone away, and we're learning how to retake care of them and what does it mean to be in relationship with the land and the language and the plant all at once. It changes you, it changes your DNA about who you are, and it gives you a reconnection back into a land that people said you were erased from. We created Hameka on the land as well. Hameka in our language means a place where we all gather. You see, in traditional ways, Native people, it's our responsibility to be good hosts to people on our land. And in order for us to be good hosts, we need to be good guests. You know, every fourth grader I talk to about being a guest, you can ask them, how do you be a good guest if you're going to your grandma's house, your best friend's house? What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to act? Oh, they say, well, you say thank you and please. You don't touch things that's not yours. You don't break things, and you don't go into somebody's refrigerator. Stuff like that, right? We all know that, right? We teach our kids so well because they all know those answers of how to be a good guest, right? Good aunties and good grandmas and good parents teach their young people how to be good guests. But as adults, we forget that we are guests in somebody else's home. If we just did that very simple thing that we tell our kids, ask for permission, say thank you and please, don't break things that aren't yours. I think we could probably learn to live in reciprocity with the land again. So this is about living in reciprocity with the land and being good hosts. This container that we've created here on what we call Lisjan, where our arbor is, Hameka is a place where it holds medicines, traditional medicines and first aid kits. It holds food. It holds these fresh water tanks that you see in Nijoni hugging. 3,000 gallons of fresh water is there. We built it out so that it could be a rain catchment system as well that these young people are putting together. And the rain catchment system catches another 1,200 gallons of water that we use to water our plants. And so we're hoping to put it in solar panels soon. We're building an outdoor kitchen, and so that this place will be a touch touchstone for the community, not just the indigenous community, but our neighbors that live there. Imagine that this is such a poor neighborhood, that this is one of those neighborhoods that won't get saved if there's a natural made or man-made disaster. That there are places that we're taking care of all over the Bay, all over Oakland or the Bay Area, that need to have these places there. Well, people are calling them now resiliency hubs, right? But these are our village sites that we are creating in this time, a place that people know that they can go that's safe, that they'll have those basic necessities met. Places where our young people are learning these skills so that they can show other people how to take care of their own homes and how to create these places in their neighborhoods. This is the short tanks that they put together. We gathered people on our land when it was safe from COVID. Hundreds of people have come here to offer prayers and have come. So these are the 5 prayer. They came and asked permission to come into our arbor to lay down prayers. And this particular run that they had that day was in remembrance of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We are growing our traditional plants on our hugels, and we're learning those kinds of ways. We're never doing this kind of work, but this is the kind of work that that has the ancestors has led us to do. We have people that are international that come and visit us, and these are our Aboriginal relatives from Australia. They asked to be met when their plane landed here. And, you know, it's our traditional ways to meet our relatives from other parts of the world and to welcome them to our land. And so we welcome them to our land. This is the second meeting. The first meeting was kind of funny. We were supposed to meet them and have this big intertribal gathering, right, with other Native people. And the person that was doing that bailed at the last minute because their flight was going to be 4 hours late and they had something else to do. And I said, but we still have to meet them. We still have to go in and do our traditional thing. They need to have permission because they believe they can't travel any further without our permission. So I met them. They came into San Francisco, and I met them at the closest In-N-Out burger. And I fed all of them. And then I welcomed them to our land. Because traditionally we feed people. Well, you know, in this day and age, we have to take those traditions and switch them up so that they fit our time sometimes. And they were super happy because there are a lot of young people there. They loved having burgers when they first got here. And then we invited them to our arbor. And these young people were the first ones to dance in that arbor. So that all the way from the other side of the world, these feet of these Indigenous people, they danced in our arbor, and we sang songs together, and we shared that. And remember that there are sacred sites all over the world that we stand in relationship with. And so this is, we're standing in relationship to Mauna Kea, which is the mountain that the Hawaiian people are fighting to save from a 40-foot telescope getting put on top of them. And UC actually has something to do with that. So I encourage people to read up on that and to support the Hawaiian people in saving their sacred site. I stand with my relatives, Native women from all over the world. And this is what rematriation looks like, is women standing in leadership to preserve and protect their sacred sites together, working in tandem to save our salmon that needs to come back up our waterways, to stand with those that are in West Papua and those that are in Kashmir, those folks that are trying to save Oak Flat. And so standing in relationship with people that are doing this work, Indigenous people all over the world, is what rematriation looks like. People don't know that West Papua is facing genocide right now by the Indonesian people, and this is backed up by the United Nations. And I ask you to look into what is happening in West Papua and our relationship specifically as California Native people. Our shores and our Pacific Ocean touches the shores of our Pacific relatives in Hawaii and West Papua and all over the Pacific. And so we have this relationship of being in reciprocity with one another and doing protocol with one another when we can. This is another land that we take care of. It's called Ramai, and Ramai is in West Oakland. Ramai means west in our language. We were able to get a long-term lease on this land. It has 13 fruit trees on it. We have redesigned containers for people to grow in. We're hoping to open this up to the community, but again, because of COVID, we weren't able to open it. We had people from all walks of life that came 2 years ago to help us to open up this land and to welcome people to this beautiful place that we're taking care of. We've created a place where we have to dry our herbs and our tobacco, and a place where we can retool our things, and are hoping that we're growing food. And we have collaborations with the American Indian Child Resource Center. They have a few boxes there for their young people to learn how to grow and to re-engage in plants, and to create some entrepreneurship of making their own salsa, I believe, that they're doing. So, you know, it's a great way for young people to re-engage in foods and how to take care of the land and be a part of that land again. And during COVID, we created a food distribution project. And this started quite accidentally. When we were all shut down, we have a verbal agreement with the Giltrack in Albany, which is a property of UC Berkeley. And this farm has been there for quite a few years. And we have a relationship with the Giltrack farm. And we have land that we take care of that is ceremonial land, and land where we're growing medicinal plants. We have a couple of beds that we're growing food in. And during, when COVID happened, we sent everybody home at the very beginning. And then probably about a month or so later, because Giltrack was closed too, because UC Berkeley closed down, they closed everything. And they were able to talk UC Berkeley into allowing for a few people to go into there to harvest and to take care of the plants that were there. And so I went over there, and Fui Lupe went over there together, and we started harvesting food and taking it to our crew, and taking it to elders and to people that were immunosuppressed. And we were giving out probably 25 bags a week. And then pretty soon all the restaurants had this surplus of food because nobody was open, and we began to get more food delivered. And pretty soon we were giving out 100 boxes of food a week to people that needed it, people with small children, people that were on the front lines during the George Floyd uprising, people that were continued to need that food. And so Sogorea Te Land Trust began to do food distribution during COVID and giving away masks and other things that were necessary. We've also been creating a way to make medicines. And so learning how to do elderberry syrup, learning how to do fire cider, working with echinacea and other medicinal plants in order for us to, and then those medicines went to people on the front lines and to our elders and to those immunosuppressed. And so sharing out this knowledge and this great abundance with our community. Right now we're working also on saving the West Berkeley Shell Mound, which is the oldest of the 425 shell mounds that ring the Bay Area. It's one of our oldest places. It's a part of our cosmology. The West Berkeley Shell Mound we've been fighting for and working on saving for now 5 years. There was a developer that wanted to put a development on here, and we found out about it right away. And we fought against it, and we had 1,400 people, over 1,400 people write letters to defend the shell mound. It is a landmark within the city. It qualifies for a state and a national historic landmark. And we have had thousands of people that have joined us in praying at this shell mound. This is a vision of what we think this 2 acres could look like. That it's a parking lot now, and it's never been built upon, which is very rare in the Bay Area, that there is a piece of property that would never be built upon. And what we know as Indigenous people is if you find a special place that maybe is just capped off because of a parking lot, but has never been built upon, it's very special and it's very rare. Well, the shell mound stayed covered under a flat parking lot for years, and then this development came. And we decided we wanted to give people a different vision of what this land could look like. Every fourth grader in the Bay Area has to learn about us, but there's nowhere that they can go. And if you have relatives that come from across the world and they don't know about the First Nation people, wouldn't it be great to have a place to take them? Wouldn't it be great for us to have access to our sacred place where we could pray, where we've continued to pray along these railroad tracks for years, even though it just looks like a parking lot. It's still sacred to us. You see, this place is a part of our first cosmologies. It's a place where my ancestors first lived along the bay. It's the very first place that babies laughed or cried, the very first place where we put a tule boat into the bay from that area. It's also a place where it aligns with what people now know as Alcatraz. And Alcatraz is a place where my ancestors didn't go, but our spirits went for 4 days while we were having ceremony on the land. And on the sunset of the 4th day, the ancestors their spirit would travel through what we call the Western Gate, which is where the Golden Gate Bridge is now. So this is a very sacred place, even though with a Western eye, you can't see it. And what if we put an arbor there and opened up Strawberry Creek, where it originally went through, built up the land to grow oak trees there, and put this mound on top of it. So you see, none of this would dig into the land ever. This is a structure that is used in architecture all over the world, and it was created by college students as a way of creating something that could take an impact without a candle blowing out. And what if we put something like that on top of there, and it was hollow? And on the outside, you could walk to the very top, and it would be covered with poppies. And 4 months out of the year, it would just be bright orange, and you could see it all the way up to the Campanile. And what if it was inside? It would be a place where we could talk about the history and the resiliency of our people. And in the center would be a 360-degree theater where you could sit in the middle and you can see, hear, feel, and smell what it was like to be at a shell mound 250 years ago. A way for us to really talk about what it is. This is what rematriation looks like. Working with the city of Berkeley, during this time, we created relationships that tribal people have not had with the city of Berkeley since its inception. And so during this time of us fighting this developer together, the city of Berkeley changed its signage. Coming into Berkeley, it says, "Welcome to the city of Berkeley, Ohlone territory." During the George Floyd uprising, when cities across the country were putting Black Lives Matters on their streets, City of Berkeley did that. But they also said, we're also going to remember we're on Ohlone territory, and we're going to put that on one of our streets as well. The city of Richmond has recently worked with us to recreate a place where they destroyed one of our shell mounds, a place called a park in Richmond that was going to be open soon. This says, "Si uti ishka, ehetma hemete mak." Water is life, and we are still here. And so we work with artists to create this together, and this will be open for tribal members to harvest plants that we particularly had put there, our medicinal plants, our food plants. We've created a way for us to do educational programs for the city of Richmond, but also a place for us to have ceremony there at least twice a year with the park closed completely to us. We are working right now with the city of Oakland to return the first piece of land ever given back to a tribe in an urban area. Some people may know Oakland, and Joaquin Miller Park is a place where we're looking at and so we created a letter of intent with the city to return this land so that we can have a ceremonial house on top of it so that we could have a place where we can gather food, where we can take care of the land around us, where we could reintroduce plants that are supposed to be in this area, and taking care of us. And so this is what a round house would look like. It's semi underneath the ground. It's a place of ceremony. It's a structure that we have not, a place of healing, a place where we have not had in our territory in 250 years. Rematriation looks like the recreation of a people before extinction. Rematriation means that we are taking back our traditional life ways and bringing people in our territories along with us. It's a healing process of the genocide that happened in 3 consecutive waves. It's about a colonization that's never ended. It's about bringing balance back into the land. It's about talking about reciprocity. So the Confederated Villages of Lisjan is that confederation that's bringing back those languages, those medicinal ways, that reconnection with land, and bringing people along with us. You see, we never left our home territory. We've always been here. And so this is some of us at a gathering. This is my auntie, the 84-year-old woman who told a story to us, me and 2 of her daughters, a few years ago in her front yard, in her front room. A story she never told her kids. She talked about Indian boarding school and how she was taken to Chochenyo boarding school when she was young, her and my mom and our Uncle Jack. And at that time, Indian foster care was much different. Indian foster care was really about training young Indian people to be domestic workers and to do those things. Well, she got that training and she went to live in a home in San Leandro, she tells us, when she was about 12 years old. And she says, oh, they were great, they were a really good white family. I took care of their kids and I cleaned their house and I did their wash and I cooked for them. And she goes, oh, this good white family, they wanted me to go to school there in San Leandro. And the city of San Leandro said no, she was too dark and they wouldn't allow her to go to school. And my auntie ended up getting married an Indian way, 14 years old. She had 8 children. She ended up working at the Acapulco restaurant in Alameda until she retired. And she still lives in Oakland today in Huchiun territory that our ancestors have lived in for thousands of years. Our matriarch here holds a lot of stories like our elders do. Don't talk about the pain, but it's now in our lifetime that we are looking at the resiliency of creating relationships with cities and counties that was never, could not even been dreamt about. I think it really started with the creation of those walks and standing up for our ancestors and not thinking of anything else, because we continue to see miracles on our land. The Sogorea Te Land Trust is about creating relationships. It's about creating relationships with our people, our Indigenous folks that live here, because it is an urban Indigenous women-led land trust. I grew up in my land, but it's not, and this is on our territory, but so many of our people came from other places, from the forced relocation policies of the United States government, and stayed here. And we know that 3 generations at least of people, many of them never got to go home. And none of them have a land base in order to grow their own medicinal plants, to have their own ceremonies, to feel free in a place that's now urbanized. And so that's what the Sogorea Te Land Trust is about as well. It's about giving us a place where we feel that we can do our ceremonies and teach our languages and be a part of that land again without outside interference. This is a beautiful picture done by an artist named Fernando Marti. And I think that it juxtaposes again our village sites against San Francisco skyline in such a beautiful manner. We're still here. We've not gone anywhere. And we invite you to be a part of building relationships and learning how to rematriate and give back to our people in a way that we can all live on this land together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Corrina. That was really beautiful. And I think the audience learned a lot today from you. So thank you so much for sharing that. And for the history of your people, it's really wonderful to see the beautiful projects you all have been working on. And quite literally seeing rematriation and land back in action is really beautiful. At this time, I'd like to open up for the Q&A. As I mentioned before, we have about 25 minutes for Q&A. For those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature. That way you can begin to insert questions and we will see them on our end. I'd actually like to start this if that's okay. I have hi Marcelo, thank you for joining us. I have a question for you, Corrina. So not everybody knows this, but California actually encompasses one of the largest Native populations in the nation. And it also encompasses the highest number of unrecognized tribes as well. And so, you know, I really appreciate all the work that your community has done and really kind of push the envelope of whether or not recognition is something that communities even necessarily need or want. And so I'm just really, you've thought about sort of working beyond recognition. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that in terms of your practice in your community.
That's a great question, Katie. I mean, and I love the way you say beyond recognition, because there's a movie called Beyond Recognition there I star in that talks about the beginning of the land trust. So that's great. And it's on Canopy. So if anybody wants to look at it, they can see it. Yeah, when I began to do work on sacred land protection, I had to look at that idea of what does it look like to be federally recognized. You know, there are multiple tribes in Chochenyo territory. Chochenyo is a language base, right? So I think that's one thing that we need to explain. That when you look at that, there was never one overarching tribe in our territory. And so sometimes that's confusing to people. So the way I like to explain it to them is that if you imagine like the county of Alameda, and within that county, there are multiple cities, and each of those cities are its own municipality, have their own laws and zonings and all of those kind of things. Well, the same was true a long time ago if you put tribes in there. There were tribes that were taking care of their own territories within each of those areas, right? So that's a simple way of understanding it. Lisjan tribe has been doing work on sacred sites protection for over 20 years when we created Indian People Organizing for Change with Genoa. And so that work has been instrumental. Now, would federal recognition do anything for us? That would be, that it could, and we have thought about as a tribe, do we want to do that? The resources that it would take for a non-federally recognized tribe to become recognized again is astronomical. So do we have the money to do that kind of work? We would have to hire ethnographers and archaeologists and lawyers and, and so for most tribes, it's out of their reach to even begin to think about doing something like that. The one tribe in our territory that has tried to get recognition tried twice and failed. And if you're on that list, because there are over 180 tribes that are non-recognized, trying to get recognition again. They're going through this very racist policy, Bureau of, I can't remember, it's called BAR. I can't remember what it stands for. But you have to prove certain things. You have to prove that you were a tribe, right? You have to prove that you have a tribal list of all your tribal members. You have to prove that you are running as a tribe. You have to have minutes that you can provide, right? So in California, it's very different. How do you prove all of those things when you are running from being killed off by 3 different governments, right? How do you do that? And then the whole idea of city-like governments did not even come into effect until the 1930s, I believe.
Yeah.
And that was really a ploy force tribes to get away from traditional ways of government and go into a city-like government. So in order to get federal funding, so that their people would actually not starve to death on the reservations. And
Right.
so that's a whole different idea. But those people that are trying to get federal recognition, the federal government is only recognizing 1.5 per year. If you're at the end of that list, how many lifetimes would I have to live in order to do that? And would I stop doing the work that I'm doing in order to put all of my energy there?
Right.
And I don't think that that's possible. I had to decide. My ancestors recognized me, I recognize them, and that's the only recognition. You have to think about also is like, why is it that American Indians are the only people in this country, the first people that ever been that were here first, have to prove who they say that they are?
Right.
Nobody else. It doesn't matter. If you say you're Irish, Scottish, French, then people believe you. If you say that you're Italian, if you're from Africa, if you're Puerto Rican, it doesn't matter. We're the only ones that have to prove our who we say that we are in order to have that. Now, would it be great? Some parts of it would. We would have a land base. We would be possibly, offered medical, and education. But even federally recognized tribes, that's difficult. You have reservations where people are recognized and their closest hospital is 150 miles away from their home.
Right.
And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to, they would give you some things, but the benefits aren't all that. I think that standing in our sovereignty, working as a tribal government and government to government relationships with cities and counties and developers in our tribal territories really works for us as a tribe. It has moved us forward in order to take care of this. I think it at this point with our tribal members that they need something that's permanent and serious, and that the work that we're doing is actually doing that. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that sort of nuanced understanding. We had a conversation with Natana Hicks a couple of weeks ago, and she was talking about how sort of recognition actually really affected their language work because there was the threat from the most recent administration to pull that recognition. And so what that instability quite literally means for a community, particularly when the language school is on that land, right? So thank you for that. We have a really great question here. This is from Pamela Villasenor. Your community's work is inspiring. Are you part of the California Community Land Trust Network? And as a follow-up question, would you be willing to form a Native Land Trust coalition with other tribal communities?
Oh, that's great. No, we are not a part of that coalition right now. We just joined a coalition called Bay Area Together, which used to be open space. I can't remember. It was something open space for many years, and they just rechanged it to Together Bay Area. Alma-Mutsun is a part of that, as well as another local tribe, and so we are a part of that. And we're hoping to work together with some land trusts that are in our territory right now. It would be, yes, we would love to create a coalition of other, we are working with other tribes, both federally recognized and non-federally recognized right now around traditional ecological knowledges and using fire as a way of taking care of our lands. And so we're working with other tribes that are doing that kind of work as well. And so we're in the middle of doing that. We're also working with folks like Save Mount Diablo. They're doing some work around canyon stuff, and we'll be working with them. We're working with park districts like Livermore Parks and Rec to give us access to our sacred sites without having to deal with a lot of red tape. And so we're building relationships as we go. And so it's, it's something that's taking some time, but yes, we're always interested in creating relationships.
Wonderful. There's a question here from Sarah. Are there any efforts to make the Shumi land tax a mandatory tax for non-Indigenous people living on Ohlone territory?
Thank you for bringing that up. And for those of you that don't know about Shumi, means a gift in our language. And it was actually a platform that's put on our website that allows people that live in our territory, live, work, or play in our territory to pay an honorary tax that helps us to do the work at Sogorea Te Land Trust. And it has been quite successful. It actually started with the Wiyot people having an island returned to them. And the 7th Generation Fund through Tia Peters actually started a fund there. So when we began this, we asked permission to do that. There are now other tribes and other folks that are doing it. We have Duwamish Real Rent, Matahatta Fund, Tongva, the Tongva people in LA are beginning to have conversations about one as well. And so it's beginning to pick up, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity for people. Now, most recently, we have had both the city of Alameda approach us about possibly putting Shumi in their next budget. So that would be interesting. We have a citizen in Kensington that's trying to push forward a mandatory tax on residents in Kensington. And we have another city, I think it might be Albany, that is looking at doing something similar as well. So the interesting thing is that it is not us that is coming up with these ideas, but there are allies and accomplices that live and work in these places that are saying, we would like to do this work on behalf of you and with you, and can we do that? And so yes, we worked with them to change the name to Chochenyo Park in City of Alameda just recently. And so that was really great. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you for responding to that question. Actually, I'm curious about the renaming of Chochenyo Park. Would you consider, so we're talking about land taxes, there's other ways sort of that people look at sort of case studies of sort of land back in action or rematriation, not to conflate the two, I think they are distinct, right? But whether that means, you know, paying a rent or like having permits for non-native folks on indigenous land, do you see, for instance, those as either iterations of land back or steps in the right back? Because basically I'm curious, is land back just land back? Like give the land back?
Yeah, give the land back.
Okay.
Give it all back. And I think that people should really like stop freaking out about giving Indians land back, right?
Yeah.
It's like, we're not going to tell y'all to all leave. That's not what's going to happen. But we have a different relationship with the land of living in reciprocity, and that has been severed because of colonization, and that there needs to be a healing of the land and what happens here, right? And we need to figure out what that is. It's indigenous leadership. That's, you know, okay, so that's part of it. So yes, let's go back to your question. Chochenyo Park, right? So Andrew Jackson Park, imagine, right? Okay, that name had to go. Okay, it had to go. There was allies that was working on changing this name for almost 2 years before we got brought into it. Not to say that they weren't trying to bring me into it. I've been really busy. And so other tribal members took on working with them and really did the work of trying to, during COVID, of trying to do education about it. There was these ideas of renaming it Alameda Park. Although the whole city is named Alameda, why do you need a park named Alameda, right?
Right.
And there was you know, and we're talking about there's still racism in this country. And so even in the Bay Area, so let's not pretend about that.
Mm-hmm.
But these young people was really adamant about getting this going. And we as a tribe did education and was able to change it to Chochenyo Park. It was a name that we chose and will be a part of with the city to do an opening. This was a beginning of a relationship with the city. Really. So because of that relationship with the city, we will be working with the Parks Department to recreate, to have access and of a garden that we hope to design and grow medicinal, that we will be able to harvest and be a part of that on the other side of the city. We're also in conversation with the city council member that brought up the idea of bringing Shumi into our as the city, part of the city budget, but also changing the curriculum within the city that allows to talk about Ohlone history, not only in 4th grade, but continuing it through middle school and high school with a collaboration with us to create that curriculum and what that looks like, and how it will evolve. And so this is a different way of when we talk about rematriation. It's about this creating these relationships that are also ongoing, right? So it's not something that's
Right.
one stop thing, but it's a relationship after I'm gone that other tribal members can push and say, we have this ongoing relationship and this is what we're going to do next. And so it has been that. Now, saying that, the city of Alameda is also currently has given a developer the green light to destroy a cemetery of ours. And so there's this, and they followed the law, which is horrifying that they followed the law, and that there was two other tribes. And this is the problem with having other folks saying stuff. There was two other tribes that gave them permission knowing they were going to hit a cemetery. And so our tribe is now the tribe that has to clean it up. And it's the most horrific thing that you would ever want to imagine. And these cemeteries have been destroyed for multiple years because of development. And it's always kept really hush hush. It's really like, we don't talk about it. My problem is that my grandchildren will not know where these ancestors are reburied if we continue to keep it hush hush. And our responsibility to the land and to the sacred places will continue to disintegrate. It's another part of our erasure if we do that. The tribe is planning on having an open funeral for over 120 ancestral remains that will be returned to the land when that happens, because I think that the Bay Area needs to see this. I think that it's time that we really open our eyes to see what kind of devastation is created because of buildings being put up that will not be here 5,000 years ago, like my ancestors' remains have been there. There's nothing that is built in this land that's going to last as long as they have been buried. And so there's a lot of different things that happen. So when you talk about rematriation, it talks about, when we talk about land back, we really need to talk about what is continuing to happen still. That's why the colonization is not over, when we continue to have to do stuff like that.
Great, thank you. It sounds like you're also talking about kind of what I was trying to bring up in beginning of this discussion, was that there needs to be action. So it sounds like some action is happening, as you're saying, these long-term relationships, and also some maybe not so great action that the city really needs to work on. So thank you for updating us on that. And I do hope that they learn to do the right thing, honestly. There's a question here, and I think you may have already answered this to an effect, but are there any efforts that have or will be implemented within California school districts that furthers the education on Ohlone people and other tribes, not only past but present, in a way to not further perpetuate erasure culture?
So there's this whole ethnic studies curriculum that's being created at the state level. And part of the ethnic studies curriculum is we have a professor that's up in Woodland that's working on it. And she has really emphasized putting shell mound and the work that we're doing currently on the West Berkeley shell mound as a part of that curriculum, really emphasizing the work that's happening in the Bay Area now and not just the past. And so, yes, there are things that are happening on the state level to make sure that that happens. And so we're so thankful that we have allies in those positions that can do that work for us and with us.
Wonderful. I had a couple of questions just to continue this conversation about land back. So one example is thinking about last summer, the fact that a 1,200 acre parcel of land was returned to the Esalen tribe of Monterey County. And what not a lot of folks don't realize, that was actually a $4.5 million real estate transaction, that there was actually an exchange of money for this. And it was a brokered, transaction. So I'm wondering if you could kind of think about future sort of land back scenarios and if they should be handled in the same way, or are we actually talking about, no, just the return of land, not a transaction?
Yes, that in the most honest sense, it should be, yes, just give the land back. Yes,
Right.
there should not be a transaction. The idea of privatization of land was
Mm-hmm.
never here prior to contact, and we did not parcel out our land into box squares, into these pieces of land that you can buy and trade. That's not an indigenous concept. We believe that we were born to a land, that we have a mountain and a waterway that we are responsible to, and that those lands are what we take care of because it takes care of us. And so there's a reciprocal relationship. This idea of privatization of land is something that's really foreign and new to California. And so, yes, the land should be given back, and we're trying to figure out how does that happen when there's these laws that were created that are on land. The highest laws in the country are private land ownership laws, and so we're in a battle right now um, with the developers at West Berkeley Shell Mound. We've been in a court case. We won the first court case. We're in appeals. That appeals just happened. The owners, during the appeals court date, put up a 6-foot fence with barbed wire around it. So now we have no access to our sacred site.
Mm.
And so, and then we have to look at what does that look like, taking away the rights of indigenous people to prey on their own sacred lands. What does that look like when we're looking at, the 1978 American Indian Religious Freedom Act? How does that affect it? And how do we begin to have those conversations? And so, yes, land back is important, and we should think about it in ways that we don't have to talk about a transaction with money. And I think the city of Oakland's trying to figure that out. The first city is trying to figure out, how do we do that? And when we first went in to have this conversation with them, it was really about that. And then it was like, oh, but you have to do all of these other things, and it's going to cost you like $50,000. And I'm like, wait a minute, you were talking about giving us land back.
Right.
Now you're telling now you're saying I have to give you we have to pay $50,000 for something. I was like, that's not giving land back.
Right.
So there needs to be some thought about how do we begin to do this. And so it's something that's not been done, right?
Yeah.
Then you have folks that are like farmers in Australia who realize that the land that they've been making money on for the last 100 years with their family just gave their land back to the Aboriginal people. There were folks that were similarly in New York that gave some land back to some traditional people, and it was just really signing the deed over to the land. It wasn't about that. But you look at huge pieces of land, like land that's in our territory right now. It's going for a lot of money. There's one piece of land that holds one of our sacred sites on it that's almost pristine, right?
Wow.
One of our in Fremont, California, and we're talking about $40 million.
Yeah. I mean, and that makes it ultimately unattainable.
Right. And so then who has the right to own someone's sacred site?
Right. Yeah.
And so, And so we really need to begin to think about laws changing. We have a great legal team who helped. We're fighting an SB 35 law, which is a law that allowed for development to happen on a ministerial kind of way instead of having to go through the California Environmental Quality Act. And so we're the first ones in the state of California to fight against that. And because it's on a sacred site, we changed some language in the law, and we were able to do that. And our legal team was able to create that law and legislation in California. And because the law was made afterwards, we're still fighting this court case. But anything going forward on a sacred site would be a very different matter. So, it's the laws and changing. And sometimes it's just a very small tweak of a comma that changes. And you just don't know until you get involved in this. This has been a huge education curve for me because I didn't go to school learning about law and zoning and,
Yeah.
so it's interesting.
Well, thank you for sharing that wonderful work. And I think one of the things that we're thinking about now is even just about climate and how the land that we have it now is really unsustainable, and quite literally giving it back to Native people who we were stewards of the land, right? Like we know how to fire suppression and burning and all that that would prevent a lot of what we're going through right now, particularly in California. But it's about that time. So I want to end on one final question here from Sarah. And the question is, what kind of help can folks provide in support of the Land Trust's work?
That's great. So I think that you work with the Indigenous peoples on whose land you're on. And if they have a land trust, ask them what's the best way to do that. I think, Shumi tax is the best way to help us right now while we're in COVID. We invite people from many different universities and colleges and high schools to come out to the land when we're not in COVID to help us work the land, to provide that. We are working with, many people thinking outside of the box. We have a young woman who had taken care of her grandparents' family home, and invited us to be a part of taking care of that land in a way that we created some food boxes that she can grow food there for her and her roommates, and we have access to their backyard or to come and harvest food if we want, or to have a meeting space. And so people are coming up with creative ways. People are growing white sage in their front yard because it's a drought tolerant thing. But they don't use it. So they call us up and ask us if we would like to harvest. So there are ways of doing that. If you have access to different materials, solar panels, different kinds of things. And so there's a wish list on our website about things that we would like. So there's always those kinds of things that you could ask to help out. But yes, we love to have people on the land. We love to create relationships with people. We need allies and accomplices in universities and places where people work, and really asking people to think about whose land you're on, what's the name of the people, what's their language that they speak, and how can you be of service, and how do we work in reciprocity and relation with each other.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Corrina, for joining us. There's a couple of resources in the chat box. I'll also paste again information about Sogorea Te. For those of you in the Santa Cruz area, please specifically look up the Amamutsan tribal bands information, as well as protecting their Jurassic site. That's particular to this region in Santa Cruz. Thank you again, Corrina. I really appreciate it. And for those of you who are here today, this will be recorded and posted up on YouTube. You can share it as well with folks who weren't able to make it. Thank you, Corrina. I hope you all have a great end of your day. And thank you so much for everything today.
Thank you.